In 1883, Mother Mary, Joseph Albert and four faithful came to Whanganui after 10 years wandering the wilds of Auckland and Hawke's Bay. At that time, New Zealand was mostly wild, scattered with sporadic settler outposts and isolated Māori villages. Mother Mary and her four faithful had been sent to revive the mission in the remote outpost of Jerusalem. Māori canoes transported the nuns upriver to the mission, which had been abandoned during the Ho-Ho troubles. She and her nuns were putting themselves in grave danger going there, but as well as speaking English, Spanish, Italian and French fluently, Mother Mary also spoke perfect Māori, and she quickly became trusted by the Māori, who invited her to study their healing techniques and herbal remedies. Combining this knowledge with her European medical training and work as a nurse in the Crimean War, she began producing medicines from a herb garden on her hillside farm. Chief among her botanical medicines was cannabis. Mother Mary was the first person known to grow cannabis in New Zealand. By the 1880s, Indian hemp resin was a popular drink in New Zealand, used by doctors, nurses and vets. Mother Mary's medicines financed the establishment of the first orphanages, Māori schools and hospitals in the country. A church was soon built where she founded New Zealand's only homegrown Catholic order, the first to accept Māori sisters, and in Tū Whare, the sisters looked after people with incurable diseases. The 1880s and 90s were years of Great Depression in New Zealand. Her community began to take in abandoned babies. She firmly refused to restrict her activities to Catholics, telling benefactors who wanted to place such a condition on donations,
"My work is the salvation of souls, not the satisfaction of Catholics."
During the period she was producing cannabis on the hillside farm beside her church, it was the most widely used medicine in the world. She prescribed it to her nuns. In her lifetime, there were no laws or social stigmas around cannabis, and very few reports of its problematic use. On the contrary, it was then the world's most important single crop. Cultivated on 6 continents for its industrial properties, as well as its value as a food crop and medicine. Mother Mary was remarkable for the breadth of her knowledge and the reach of her social concern. She is one of the most important figures in the nation's history, influencing developments in social welfare, health, the treatment of women and children, education, Māori scholarship, and she was instrumental in fostering tolerance and cooperation in New Zealand. In 2004, the Vatican began the beatification of Mother Mary Joseph Albert. She would be the country's first saint. When she died at the age of 91 in 1926, she received the largest funeral to honour any woman in New Zealand history. In 1927, in compliance with international drug control treaties driven by the United States, the Dangerous Drugs Act was passed into law. Cannabis has been prohibited in New Zealand ever since.
Wonderful people are smoking with us.
Handcuff, only go with your handcuff, alright? Out of the way or you'll get yourself locked up, right?
Through US coercion, mainly exerted through the United Nations, the myth of a drug-free America has created a world overrun with illicit drugs. A $350 billion black market. New Zealand has been particularly hard hit by the adoption of American drug war hysteria. Since the declaration of Nixon's drug war, 22 million Americans have been arrested for marijuana. There's only one country in the world with a higher arrest rate: New Zealand.
This is the time and this is the place to take off the gloves and sock it to 'em.
The drug war, which is really a modern worldwide civil war that we're all living in today, claiming millions of lives and costing trillions of dollars, it really only has one single father. The sole architect of the modern drug war was Richard Nixon. Nixon comes to power in 1969, and he's faced with a large popular movement demanding the decriminalization of cannabis. So to buy time, he orders a new commission to study the supposed harmful effects of marijuana.
Well, there is a commission that is supposed to make recommendations to me about this subject.
And then he hand-picked a right-wing panel headed by a conservative Republican governor, Raymond Schaefer, and directly instructed them to take a hard line so he could get the justification he needed for ramping up his war against the counterculture that was opposing his misadventures in Southeast Asia.
I want a goddamn strong statement on marijuana from this son of a bitch in council. I mean one that tears the ass off them. I want to hit the marijuana thing, and by God, I want to hit it right square in the puss. I want to find a way of putting more on that.
In the late 60s and early 70s in North America, maybe a little bit later in Australia and New Zealand, in which to be part of a new generation, to feel like you were part of the counterculture, you had to be smoking cannabis, essentially. And that's what set off the dynamic of what we've had for the last 40 or 50 years.
So it was really, really important for him to be able to demonise the anti-war protesters as users of the evil drug, and therefore they could criminalise them, and therefore they could arrest them. And that was the most important thing. So in other words, you could cut the legs out of the anti-war movement at that particular time.
I shall soon propose a revision of the entire federal criminal code, which will give us tougher penalties against drugs and against crime.
The Schaefer Commission was the most in-depth investigation ever conducted by the government. And unfortunately for Nixon, like the results of just about every government study on marijuana, the results favored decriminalization.
If a person does, by any chance, use it, that person should not be stigmatized with a criminal sanction.
But they didn't fit with Nixon's political program, so he ignored them. And instead, the focus was much more on getting tough and crackdowns and a war on drugs. And unfortunately, a war on drugs generally tends to be a war on people. You don't declare war on inert substances. It's the people who are involved with those substances in different ways who carry the cost of those wars. They're the victims of those wars. And it generally is the most vulnerable people in population who carry the greatest burden.
He then went on television to announce the escalation of his war on marijuana.
A new all-out offensive.
And the worst part of all of this was that through U.S. diplomatic power in the United Nations, this inane policy was exported globally.
In terms of its influence on the rest of the world, I think Nixon defined the core themes for a populist law and order response to drugs. The things that were picked up and deployed internationally was very much the populist law and order crackdown approach of get tough on drugs, get tough on drug users, hype the threat, and then present yourself and your enforcement response as the way of defending the people from that threat.
Like any other drugs in the schedule to the Misuse of Drugs Act, it's because at the time the Act was enacted, the political perception was that these were the most harmful drugs that needed to be dealt with in legislation.
Nearly every country in the world, including the United States, is a signatory to an international law banning the use, sale, cultivation, and possession of dangerous drugs such as heroin and marijuana.
The U.S., my government, we've been the superpower for many years, and we were emotionally and politically committed to driving this war on drugs strategy. And so my government was relentless for many, many decades on this front. I mean, really driving the U.S. approach. Our Drug Enforcement Administration became the most international police force in history. We advocated our methods. We strong-armed and provided incentives for other governments to sign on to increasingly prohibitionist global conventions. And I think other governments knew that if they dissented, the U.S. Congress could actually act angrily and hurt other governments. The way to think about U.S. drug policy, international U.S. drug policy, think of it as an international projection of a domestic psychosis.
At the time, America was seen as the shining example of Western civilization, and New Zealand quickly fell into lockstep with the example set by America, sending over criminologists and police to learn this U.S. model of drug control. They came away believing that the current legislation at that time, the Narcotics Act, didn't offer New Zealand sufficient protection from this imaginary marijuana menace. They thought stronger deterrents to drugs were needed.
Nixon had the most brutal attitude when it came to drug control. It was all about enforcement and punishment. There was absolutely no compassion for the drug user from a health and welfare perspective. And we still live with the legacy of that today here in New Zealand.
While still in the process of occupying their brand new building, the Beehive, the New Zealand Parliament passed the Misuse of Drugs Act. The following year, Jimmy Carter appeared on the scene moments too late to explain that it was all a terrible mistake.
Tonight on Headline News, President Carter proposes major changes to federal drug laws.
I support a change in law to end federal criminal penalties for possession of up to 1 ounce of marijuana.
McGruff here. I want you to learn a song that tells people to say no to drugs. Users are losers and losers are users. So don't use drugs. Don't use drugs. Winners don't use.
Just say no.
Just say no. Say no. Drugs. Don't use drugs. If you know a user even part of the time, tell them to quit, take your bite out of crime. Users are losers and losers are users. So don't use drugs. Don't use drugs. Okay, everybody.
If you do drugs, you will be caught. And when you're caught, you will be punished.
Users are losers and losers are users.
Some think there won't be room for them in jail. We'll make room.
Nice going. Now teach it to your mom and dad and brothers and sisters and friends to help take a bite out of crime. Use drugs.
So when we say no to drugs, it'll be clear that we mean absolutely none.
This portion of Inauguration Day is sponsored by Comtrex, the multi-symptom cold reliever.
Execute the office of President of the United States.
Big pharmaceutical companies, big alcohol, big tobacco were funding these kinds of political campaigns that supported the narrative that was being propagated by this very corrupt regime.
The year the first Your Brain on Drugs ad was produced by the Partnership for a Drug-Free America, they happened to receive $1.1 million in donations from tobacco, liquor, and pharmaceutical firms.
We can all drink to this one.
Alcohol, tobacco, pharmaceuticals, they weren't the problem. It was the drugs that within the white middle class consciousness of those times, and even still today, were associated with brown or black people. Those were the ones that the kids needed to be protected from. And it wasn't just in America. America took it upon itself to police the whole world.
We are determined to build the drug-free America and to join with others to combat drugs around the world. Let there be no doubt, this is ultimately a struggle for human freedom.
The narrative around drugs has been very much framed by policymakers and politicians as a threat to our children, a threat to our safety, a threat to the very fabric of society. And in that context, a kind of war mentality, a war on drugs is somehow justified. And when you're fighting a war, particularly when the threat that you're fighting against has been very much set up as, evil, and it's not just political rhetoric. The term evil is used to describe drugs in the preamble to the 1961 Single Convention, which is our founding legal document of the war on drugs. So if you're fighting this crusade almost against evil, you don't need to justify it in terms of statistics that can show it actually works or show it's effective. It's almost right in and of itself because you're fighting a bad thing. And what that's done is it's licensed governments to do all kinds of extreme, unpleasant things with very little scrutiny. A whole range of horrendous human rights abuses perpetrated by governments, not just the cartels. Governments are doing these things. Governments are killing people in the name of the war on drugs. We have mass incarceration. As many as 2 million people around the world, a fifth or even a quarter of the global prison population, is actually in prison for drug offences. All of these horrendous abuses being perpetuated by governments in the name of the war on drugs.